I'm seeing people joining. That's wonderful. Welcome. Again, please go ahead and add your name and where you're joining us from in the chat box so people can see who's sharing this experience with you. We're just waiting a couple of minutes as more people join us. So welcome to those of you who just logged in. During today's seminar, we're going to be using the chat function to receive your input. So go ahead and try that out by putting in your name and where you're joining us from, and we'll get started in just another minute. All right, welcome everyone, aloha. Welcome to today's online seminar. It's a preservation seminar on identification of historic properties. And we're just so pleased to have all of you join us today. Thank you for being with us. We are recording, and this is also being restreamed on YouTube and Facebook Live. So it will be available afterwards for people to revisit or to watch at your leisure as well. Today's seminar is a co-production with several partners. I'm Kirsten Faulkner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation, which is a statewide nonprofit organization that helps people save historic places in the state of Hawaii. This class is also supported by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nandoskar, who you will hear from later in the program. And we have additional technical support by Michelle Kizik, our Development Assistant. So we welcome all of our members and those who would like to become members as well. Thank you. We are joined also as a co-production with the National Park Service. Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo is the Preservation Partnerships and History Program Manager in the NPS region that includes Hawaii, and she's joining us from California. As you know, the National Park Service preserves natural and cultural resources and values for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of both present and future generations. So thank you, Dr. Jackson-Rotondo, for being part of this program. Stanton Enomoto is the Senior Program Director for the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations at the U.S. Department of the Interior. He's joining us from Hawaii Kai on Oahu. The Office of Native Hawaiian Relations was established in 2004 to assist the Secretary of the Interior with responsibilities for Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian Homelands Trust. So we're especially pleased to have the office join us as they're the liaison with the Native Hawaiian community and coordinates with the department and its bureaus on issues that affect Native Hawaiian resources, rights, and lands. So welcome, Stanton. This training is going to present an overview of the definitions, criteria, and considerations for the identification of historic properties. We're really going to be focusing on determining if a property is eligible for listing on the National or State of Hawaii registers of historic places. We're going to include an overview of the different types of historic designations and the criteria for a property to be considered historic. We won't have time today to go into preparing nominations on how to nominate or list properties on the historic registers, but we will be giving a quick overview of that process for nominating and listing. So if you're interested in a follow-up training that covers the research and writing process, please let us know that in the chat or by email after the class. We'll also have a short course evaluation, that pop-up questionnaire that comes at the end of the webinar, so please complete that before you go as well. Today's seminar will be about 90 minutes. The first portion is a presentation about the general concepts, and that will be followed by audience questions. So if you have questions as we go, please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we will get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have. We're also going to have a few knowledge checks with our audience as we go through the presentation. So these will be pop-up boxes on the screen, and we'll ask all of the participants to click on the best answer. We'll give that a few moments and then share the results. These answers are aggregated, they're anonymous, we're not going to know how each individual responds, but these check-ins will help us know if the information is clear, and it will help us connect to a virtual audience since we can't see you. So we're going to try that first with a general question. So you'll be seeing a pop-up box that says, please indicate your affiliation or your primary interest in basically why you joined us today in identifying historic properties. And you can select more than one. We know that people have multiple affiliations. So Native Hawaiian organization, federal, state, or local government, community or preservation organization, maybe a land use professional, such as a planner, architect, landscape architect, engineer, working in the construction industry, et cetera. Perhaps a public or community interest, maybe a property owner or manager or a developer, or of course other. So, you know, if you're in the education field or joining us from none of the above, but something else. So please go ahead and select all that apply. We'll give that a few moments. So Andrea, when you see enough people, you can close that. All right, it looks like we have about 29% of you are public or community interests, so that's excellent. Another 29% are federal, state, or local government. We have other at 22%, property owners and developers at 21%, and then land use professionals and Native Hawaiian organizations both at land use professionals at 17, Native Hawaiian organizations at 7, and community and preservation organizations at 14. So that's a really nice cross-section and diverse group. So that's exciting. So thank you all for being here and being part of this. So I am going to turn this over to Stanton Enomoto, who's going to take us through the first section. So Stanton, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, let's start getting into the content here and talking about the various types of historic designations that we have. We're going to start kind of broad and then work our way down, getting more focused. Next slide, please. Okay, so, you know, there's a variety of different historic designation types. Some can occur at the international level. There's a number of designations here at the national and all the way down to the state as well as the county or local level. It's important to recognize, I think, that just because you may have a historic property may have international recognition, that it's not eligible or a national recognition, they're not mutually exclusive. So the same property type can be recognized at various scales. So next slide. So starting out at the international level, you have this World Heritage Site designation. It's identified by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as UNESCO. There's a whole nomination process. And then, it gets inscribed on a list of World Heritage Sites. We're not going to be covering this international scale today, but I think it's important to note that, there is this international recognition. And here in Hawaii, I believe we have 2 World Heritage Sites, one that you see in the photo, Papahanaumokuakea, which is the northwestern Hawaiian Islands here, as well as Hawaii Volcanoes National Park is also a World Heritage Site. So next slide. Okay, at the national level, there's a variety of designations. Some are specifically for property that's owned by the federal government or the United States, such as national parks or memorials or trails, or monuments as well that are designated by the president and Congress. And then there are also other designations for National Historic Landmarks, as well as the National Register of Historic Places. And we'll probably be spending most of our time today talking about, the National Register. I think it's also important to note that both National Historic Landmarks as well as National Register sites can be both public or private. They don't have to be owned by the federal government. So any property can be nominated and inscribed on the register. The example that we see here is of Pearl Harbor. It's the Arizona Memorial. And again, like I mentioned before, a particular site can have multiple designations. So you see, for example, the ship, the USS Arizona, which lies beneath the memorial, as well as the USS Utah on the other side of Ford Island, are both National Historic Landmarks. The Pearl Harbor Naval Station is also a National Historic Landmark and an active military base. The memorial itself, the broader Battleship Row, the bungalows that exist on Ford Island, as well as the visitor center, were designated by Congress as a national memorial. So again, a particular place can have all of these different layers of designation. Next slide. So at the state level, it's fairly similar. State monuments, lands that are owned by the state parks can also be designated as historic or as monuments, what have you. The state also maintains a registry of historic places. They get designated by the Historic Places Review Board. There is a little bit of distinction, and we'll get into this a little bit further, between Hawaii law and federal law, and this designation of significance historic properties that are eligible. Hawaii is also unique in that, it differs than federal law in that all properties that are older than 50 years take on this historic status, or they can be considered as a historic property. However, it's those significant historic properties that are placed on the state registry. The example we have here is the Linekona building. It's part of the Honolulu Museum of Art. It's both on the state register and on the national register as well. So it has two designations. So let's see, next slide. At the county level, counties can apply also through approval by the county council, designations for parks or special design districts. 3 of the counties have preservation review boards or commissions that review areas for these designations. So Kauai, Maui, and Hawaii County. In this example here, we have Ka'ahumanu Church, which is in Wailuku, and it was designated by Maui County as a historic district. There's 2 other historic districts on Maui, both of which are in Lahaina. So again, international all the way down to the county level, properties can have multiple designations. So let's move into our first quick knowledge check. A property may have only one type of historic designation, true or false. We'll give everyone a second for that. Okay, right on. Most of you got it. Okay, so now that we covered kind of the various types of, the answer is false. Again, a property can have more than one type of historic designation, although again, from county to international. Okay, so moving on, let's shift gears a little bit from designations to the actual kinds of property types and their definitions. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be focusing mostly on national and the state register of historic places. The laws are very similar, but yeah, state of Hawaii has a few nuances and differences, and we'll get into those. Okay, next slide. So starting out kind of broadly again, what actually is a historic property and how are they defined under various laws? At the federal level, the criteria for determining eligibility for listing on the National Register is set within federal regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations. In this case, it's 36 CFR Part 60. And it applies, as you see there, to buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts. I'll get into that a little bit further. There was also an amendment to the National Historic Preservation Act, I believe in 1992, that allowed properties that are of significance to Native Hawaiian organizations, either for religious purposes or cultural purposes, to be considered eligible for the National Register. So, next slide. At the state level, it's similar, and historic properties are defined under Hawaii Revised Statutes or HRS 6E. And again, a historic property goes back to those types as a building, structure, object, district, area, or site. And this is the nuance. In Hawaii, we also include heiau, or Hawaiian temples, as well as underwater sites that are over 50 years old. However, for registry on the state register, it gets into that notion of a significant historic property, and the eligibility criteria are laid out in Hawaii Administrative Rules, Title 13. Yeah, so let's see, next slide. Looking at the register itself, I'll talk about it both from the federal and state level. Why is this important? What was the significance of the National Register? It was authorized or established under the National Historic Preservation Act back in 1966. And it authorized the Secretary of the Interior to recognize not only properties of national significance, but those properties that at the local and state level that were significant for history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. So the National Register of Historic Places is that official list, and it's maintained and managed by the National Park Service on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. So next slide. Some of the founding principles around the National Register, it really sets out that Congress meant to develop these principles and said, the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected through its historic heritage. So pretty bold statements. And, these principles go on to describe the importance of the historic and cultural foundations as part of, a living part of our community life. So the preservation of these historic places is in the public interest and contributes to the vital legacy of, cultural, education, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits. So next slide. Similarly, at the state level, there's these kinds of aspirational statements recognizing the significance of Hawaiian history and architecture, archaeology, and culture, how it's in the public interest to preserve these places, and that it enhances our environmental quality, and is of great social, cultural, economical, or educational rather value. So next slide. So with, covering the types of designations, getting into the background of various state and federal laws around preservation, let's look a little bit more closely at those property types. And, Again, both federal and state law are fairly similar. They identify, 5 basic types. The state law goes a little bit further. The 5 basic types of historic properties are buildings, and definition of buildings are those that are intended to shelter some sort of human activity. So it could range from a house to a jail to a church, etc. It's a place where people were meant to gather under a roof, right, and be sheltered. Structures, on the other hand, are more functional in nature. So they're obviously human constructed, but they serve some other purpose than sheltering a human activity. So things like a bridge or a railroad or even a ship could be considered as a structure. Okay, next slide. Another 2 property types that are recognized or acknowledged in the law is a site. And here it's more reflective of a significant event that possesses some kind of historic or cultural or archaeological value. So archaeological sites are most typically designated as a site, but it could also include battlefields as well as landscapes. Objects are a little bit different. They're much smaller in nature. They can include monuments, statues, as you see here, Kamehameha, or even fountains if they have some historic value to them. So those are objects. Next slide. The 5th type of historic property type is referred to as a district. And this is a much broader area. So it's a geographically definable area. It does not necessarily need to be contiguous. However, the structures or buildings or objects that exist within the district need to have some relationship to each other, whether it's historical or there's some quality by association, what have you. There has to be some theme that ties all of these properties together to be able to define a district. And some examples that you see here on the left is the Lahaina Historical District on Maui. The middle photo is the Wailua Heiau Complex on Kauai. It's also a National Historic Landmark. And then the third on the right is a photo of Chinatown here on Oahu, which is a broader historic district. So just a few examples. There are several other districts like Kalaupapa, as well as the Lihue Civic Center on Kauai that are also registered as districts. Okay, next slide. Okay, this takes us into another knowledge check. So on the island of Kauai, on the west side, in the town of Hanapepe, there's a series of salt pans that are used by Native Hawaiians for traditional customary practices of making salt. As you can see here in the photo. So the knowledge check, I think we can go to the next slide. The actual question is, if you were evaluating this property or this area as for historic preservation purposes, how might you define it? Would you think of it as a building, a structure, site, or as an object or a district, or none of the above? So I'll give you folks a few minutes to think about it. Okay, right on. Okay, correct. I think we can go to the answer slide. So yes, the property is a site. It's used for traditional customary practices. Obviously you don't see any buildings there or monuments, fountains, etc. So yeah, it meets the definition for a site. At this point, I think my section is over, and I'm going to be turning it over to Elaine to talk about significance and integrity.
Great, thank you, Stanton. As already stated, we're going to focus on the significance criteria and the integrity assessment that are used to evaluate whether a property is eligible for listing on the National Register or State Register. We will start with significance. There are 4 significance criteria under the National Register. These are identified each by a letter and are summarized as events, people, design, or construction, and information potential. The Hawaii State Register actually has 5 criteria. The first 4, A through D, are the same as the National Register. However, the 5th criteria, criterion E, is unique to the Hawaii Register and can be summarized as cultural. Criterion A is under the National Register and State Register is in association with historical events. Properties can be eligible for the National Register if they're associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. For the example that you see in the slide, Leke Burial Ground is significant for events associated with the Battle of Kua'amo'o. Next slide. Criterion B applies to properties that are strongly associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. We need to keep in mind that the property needs to have a direct association with the historic person and be relevant to the reasons why that person is important. So it's not any location where the person may have lived or visited at some point in their life. In the example on the slide, we have Washington Place in Honolulu. It is associated with Queen Liliuokalani as her personal residence and where she lived out most of her adult life. Criterion C applies to design, construction, architecture, landscape architecture, and engineering properties. It is used to recognize properties that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or possess high artistic values, or that represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. And this last type of properties mainly apply to districts. In the slide, you see the Bishop one of the buildings from the Bishop Museum Historic District, which is listed on the National Register in part for its significance as an example of late 19th century museum design and construction. Criterion D is used to recognize properties that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in the prehistory or history of the United States. It is often applied to archaeological sites or areas that have been affected by later periods of development. The Puka Neloa and the Laoa stone are significant for information about Native Hawaiian life and customs. That's the image that you see on the slide. Criterion E, which I mentioned earlier, is applicable under the Hawaii State Register and is used to recognize properties that have important value to the Native Hawaiian people or to another ethnic group of the state due to associations with cultural practices once carried out or still carried out at the property, or due to the associations with traditional beliefs, events, or oral accounts, these associations being important to the group's history and cultural identity. In the image, we have the Kilauea crater, which was and is the permanent home of the Polynesian volcano goddess Pele. In his historic times, Pele had priests, temples, and worshipers in all major islands and is believed to have been involved in important historic events, some of which are associated with the founding of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Many individuals still make offerings to Pele. After determining a property's historic significance, you must also establish the time when the property was significant. In other words, the length of time when the property was associated with the state events or the historic events or person, or when the property attained the characteristics that qualify it as significant. We refer to this as the period of significance, and it basically notes when the historic person was present, the events occurred, or the design or construction period, or other span of time when the property attained its significance. The periods of significance includes both a beginning and end date, though there may also be specific dates within the range that are important. In the slide, we have an image of the US Naval Base Pearl Harbor, which is associated with World War II, and other properties may also be, this may be the case for other properties associated with World War II. It has a period of significance that includes the buildup and planning for the war through the armistice, so 1940 to 1945. But in this case of Pearl Harbor, it would also include a specific date of December 7th, 1941, as the date when Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on Oahu. So we're going to try an example. Listen to this description, and then we'll ask which period of significance might apply. This property in the slide is located in Kailua on Oahu. Major Edward Boyd and his wife bought the land in 1869, designing an elaborate estate where King Kalakaua and his sister Liliuokalani attended parties or simply came for rest. Liliuokalani composed the beloved song Aloha Oe after an 1878 visit to the estate. Two different sugar plantation owners owned the property from 1893 until 1941. Since 1941, there have been a variety of additional owners and uses, including a military retreat, Girl Scout camp, and a golf course. So the question is, the property is potentially eligible for which areas of significance? A, historic events, B, historic people, C, design and construction, D, information potential, none of these. You can check all that apply. We'll give you a few minutes. Once we have most of the answers, well, great. We have, it looks like quite a few people checked more than one. We have 76% of participants have said historic events, 95% have said historic people, 53% have said design and construction, and 42% have said information potential, with 2% saying none of these. We can go to the next slide. The correct answer is all of these. The property demonstrates how, on a single location, as Stanton had earlier spoke to, often there are multiple layers of history present and many areas of significance. The property is usually known as the Queen's Retreat or by the names of one of the owners, the Boyd, Irwin, or Hedeman Estate. Next slide. In addition to significance, historic integrity must be evident in a property through specific historic qualities. This is required under the National Register. Although there is a level of subjectivity in evaluating integrity, the assessment must always be grounded in an understanding of a property's physical features. So it's what is there on the ground and how they relate to the significance of the property. There are 7 aspects of integrity recognized in the regulations. These are setting, location, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. A historic property doesn't need to retain all 7 aspects of integrity. However, it must retain sufficient integrity to communicate its significance. So there needs to be enough historic fabric or the setting, et cetera, present in order to understand the property. We're going to take a look at the Iolani Palace located in Honolulu to illustrate the 7 aspects of integrity. Since the aspects of integrity are understood in terms of significance, let's just speak a little bit about the significance of the property. The Iolani Palace was designated a National Historic Landmark for its association with and symbol of Hawaiian independence. While the boundary of the NHL includes a 10-acre area encircled by 4 major streets and other resources. For the purposes of our integrity discussion, we're going to really just focus on the palace and basically focus on the exterior of the resource. The 2 photos in the image of the palace were taken approximately 100 years apart. Let's start with setting. The palace building is surrounded, as you can see in the photo, by open space with large ceremonial areas. Some changes have occurred with the relocation of a coronation pavilion and Halekoa barracks and the addition of a burial mound. Also, formal gardens have been replaced by an asphalt parking lot, and some species of trees have changed. However, the view sheds and the large open spaces are largely intact. The location hasn't changed. The building was not moved and it's in its original location. Aspect of design, the overall form, mass, footprint, fenestration, architectural detailing, and other components of the design remain intact. Temporary modular shelters at one point were installed in the lanai when the territorial legislature occupied the building. They were removed during the restoration of the palace in the 1960s. And so you can see when you compare the 2 photos that the integrity of design is pretty evident. The aspect of materials, the primary materials of the building are unchanged. Some of the window panes have been replaced and repairs have been made. However, they were done using materials that matched the original. The workmanship, the high artistic value of the finishes and details are also still very evident. The aspect of feeling, sometimes feeling is one of the aspects of integrity that people struggle with. But with the building, in this case, while the building is no longer an official royal residence and is now a museum, it still retains a feeling of grandeur, national pride, ceremonial presence, and monumentality. And the last aspect, association, the palace continues to be a location where there are public gatherings and commemorations take place, especially those associated with civic and Hawaiian ceremonies. Next slide. We often are asked about cultural landscapes. Under the National Register criteria and guidance, cultural landscapes are not considered a separate, distinctive property type. As Stanton stated earlier, the 5 property types for National Register listing are buildings, structures, sites, districts, and objects. So if a cultural landscape isn't considered a separate, distinct property type, what is a cultural landscape? Cultural landscape inventory, identification, and documentation includes the intertwined built and natural features and characteristics of places where humans have interacted with the physical environment. These landscape characteristics and features are physical expressions or evidence of both tangible and intangible aspects of a place that either influence the history of a landscape's development or are products of its development. Cultural landscapes can be found anywhere from cities to forests. They're varying in size from thousands of acres to less than an acre and are generally categorized under 4 types: design landscapes, vernacular landscapes, historic sites, and ethnographic landscapes. Cultural landscapes are evaluated and processed for listing on the National Register using the same criteria that we previously discussed and in accordance with 36 CFR 60, the federal regulations. The methods used for documenting and assessing cultural landscapes are particularly useful for landscapes that were transformed over time through different uses and occupants. The example that you see in the images on the slide are of the Tinian Northfield and Landing Beaches National Historic Landmark District. It's a large district that is layered with traditional Chamorro Lati period sites, a traditional cultural property associated with traditional fishing practices, resources constructed during the period of Japanese colonial expansion in the 1930s, and military occupation during World War II, as well as resources constructed by the US military. A cultural landscape documentation of this site included this evolution of historical land use and presence on the site. Another question frequently asked is, what about traditional cultural properties? Under the National Register of Historic Places, traditional cultural properties, or TCPs, as we often refer to them, they're properties that are eligible for inclusion in the National Register based on associations with cultural practices, traditions, beliefs, lifeways, arts, crafts, and social institutions of a living community. This is an image of Nantucket Sound, which was determined eligible for listing on the National Register as a TCP, as a significant and distinguishable place integral to the Wampanoag's folk life traditions, practices, cosmology, religion, material culture, foodways, mentoring, and narratives. More specifically and concisely, a TCP is a physical place, so site, district, structure, building, or object that is rooted in a traditional community's history and important in maintaining the community's ongoing identity. And I want to emphasize the and in that last bullet of maintaining the community's ongoing identity. For the Nantucket Sound, the place is a physically definable area of water highlighted in the oval. And as you can see, the area is quite large. And it's also worth mentioning that the determination of eligibility also found that the TCP is a contributing site to a larger, yet to be defined historic district and archaeological district under all four criteria, A, B, C, and D. Some of the National Register guidance, including the National Register Bulletin 38, uses the term traditional cultural community when discussing TCPs. In this context, a traditional cultural community is one that has beliefs, customs, and practices that have continued over time, have been passed down through generations and shared, and help to define the traditions of the community to the present day. We want to note that under the National Register, traditional cultural communities are not limited to Native Hawaiian, Native American, or any specific ethnic or indigenous group. TCPs are recognized in consultation with the traditional community to whom they are significant. So it's kind of hard to understand as an outsider what might be a TCP unless you really need to consult with the community. This is an image of Medicine Wheel National Historic Landmark. When the property was originally designated in 1970, the boundary included only the area immediately surrounding the Medicine Wheel. In preparing an update to the nomination, there was additional consultation with the traditional communities, which resulted in one, not only an increase in the boundary to include a larger portion of the mountaintop, but also a renaming the NHL to Medicine Mountain. Because when you think about the broadening of the boundary, one of the reasons that the boundary was expanded was that the wheel was only one aspect of the broader landscape important to the cultural practices and beliefs of a traditional community. And in this case, it was more than one tribal community to whom this site was important. Like other properties evaluated for the listing on the National Register, the eligibility of TCPs is evaluated using the National Register criteria for evaluation and National Register guidance, such as Bulletin 38, which I mentioned earlier. And nominations for TCPs are processed in accordance with federal regulations that govern the process for all nominations, 36 CFR 60. We wanted to end this section with a Hawaii example. In this case with Ha'ena on Kauai. Stanton is more familiar with this property, and I will turn the presentation over to him.
Okay, yeah, mahalo, Elaine, for that. So yeah, Elaine covered a few examples on the East Coast as well as in the continental US. So what might it look like a TCP? So as she mentioned, we have this example here of the Ha'ena area on the island of Kauai. Ha'ena, by the way, is not officially registered as a TCP or listed on the National Register, but we show this just as an example of what that process might look like, or what some of the features in the landscape that might contribute to a nomination. So those of you that are familiar with Kauai, Ha'ena is, or not familiar with Kauai, you get into the Napali coastline to the west. So within this area of Ha'ena, as you can see, there's a number of features ranging from, lo'ikalo or traditional farming areas, aquaculture areas, at least historically known archaeological or aquaculture areas or fish ponds. There's also a number of natural features that have cultural significance. There's a mountain peak, Makana, just uphill from the coastline. There's also a number of caves in the area, Waiakanaloa, for example, that also have, by being named, have cultural significance. So there's a variety of features. Coastal dunes, the cliff line itself also has cultural significance. So not only do you have early Native Hawaiian presence and activity in the area, you have natural features that contributed to that story, that history. There's also human constructed features, and by that I mean things like heiau, or even the lo'ikalo, the taro fields themselves were constructed by humans. The fish ponds that were once there were also human built. And it doesn't necessarily limit itself to traditional Hawaiian structures, but even more contemporary, there's the Allerton House that's in Ha'ena. Also contribute to it. Traditionally, you also have, this notion of association, that Elaine talked about, of the 7 aspects of integrity. Association is, can be a bit subjective, but it's one of the aspects. And in the case of Ha'ena, there's a lot of traditions around Pele and Lohiau in that area. So that those stories contribute to association to the people that are still there, working the land or accessing the resources of that land. So combined, I think that's what makes up a traditional cultural property. It's this fabric of ongoing practices, whether they be hula, farming, what have you, natural features, human constructed features, and this sense of association. So again, the regulations kind of spell out things more specifically, but that's kind of, if one is interested in looking to get a traditional cultural property designated, that's the kind of fabric and interweaving of a narrative that you want to work towards. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andrea, who's going to get us actually into that process of how do you nominate and list properties on the register. So over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stanton. So we've spent most of our time on the criteria and considerations that establish that a property is eligible for listing on the National or Hawaii Register of Historic Places. These factors are intrinsic and inherent in the nature of the property, whether or not it is formally nominated to or listed on a historic register. If a property owner or other stakeholder seeks formal recognition for the historic property, there is a methodical and consistent governmental process that regulates the procedure. For non-federal properties, the State of Hawaii process begins with completing the nomination form, which describes the property, its significance, its character, and integrity. At the end of this presentation, we list some of the resources that give information on where to find the form and how to complete it. The time and effort to complete the form really depends on the complexity and history of the site, as well as how accessible the information may be. We're not focused on the form itself today, but we'll go over the formal designation process once it's complete. Federally owned properties have a slightly different process, and other states also have their own regulations and procedures that may differ from Hawaii processes. Because of time limitations, we will only be discussing the Hawaii framework today. So step one is the nominator submitting the completed nomination form to the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division, abbreviated SHPD. A nomination may be submitted by anyone, so property owner, local preservation commission or government, or any other interested party. Property owner notification and opportunity to comment is required. Owner consent is not required for the state register, but it is required for the national register, and it is desirable for both. If the owner actively objects to the listing, they can request a contested case hearing, which is another type of quasi-judicial hearing and process. SHPD professional staff will review the form for completeness and have time to comment. And the SHPD staff will also schedule the nomination for the public hearing before the Hawaii Historic Places Review Board. The review board is comprised of 10 professionals with expertise in architecture, archaeology, Hawaiian history and culture, sociology, and other relevant areas. The members are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. Members serve 4-year terms, and meetings of the review board are usually held quarterly. Public notice is a very important part of the process. Meetings are public and must comply with sunshine laws for open meetings and open records. There are specific timeframes, as you note in the slide, for notifying various parties, including the owner, local governments, and the public. At the meeting, the review board hears the case for the nomination, takes public comment, and makes formal findings on the completeness of the information and really whether or not the property is significant and has integrity. The review board may take one of 3 actions: approve the nomination for listing on the Hawaii Register of Historic Places, request modifications to the nomination, or reject the nomination. If the review board approves the nomination, it is listed on the Hawaii State Register of Historic Places, and the state process is complete. The review board may also recommend nominations for the National Register. So for nominations recommended for the National Register, SHPD certifies that the nomination is complete and that it conforms to National Park Service standards. SHPD then forwards the nomination to the keeper of the National Register, who makes the final determination on whether or not to list the property on the National Register. Nominations will be listed on the National Register within 45 days of submittal to the National Park Service, or if the nomination is rejected, the NPS will provide detailed reasoning. Finally, the property is listed on both the state and national registers. And that's how it goes.
All right. Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to invite all of our speakers to come back, and we're going to address questions that we've received from our audience, so we can try to, I guess, answer as many questions as we can. So I have to pull up the questions so I can get to them. So there was a question about criterion E on the Hawaii Register of Historic Places. And because the form for nominating to both the state and the National Register is the same form, there is no actual checkbox for criterion E. So there's just a question about how that works. Unfortunately, today we weren't able to have someone from the State Historic Preservation Division join us, and that's really kind of their area of expertise. So I think we're going to have to take this question and respond in writing afterwards. But I will say my understanding of how this works is the staff makes a determination of significance, and then the actual listing still looks at the criterion A through D. So E could be part of the significance, but they would still kind of wrap it up in some of the earlier ones. So I don't know if Andrea or Stanton, if you have a different understanding of that.
No.
I don't either.
Okay. Let's see. So here's another question. A family crypt that is over 200 years old is located on a registered historic site. So how does that affect the families who have active burials and are continuing to use it? So are there any expectations, I guess, for continuing use, especially in the case of a burial site? So, let's see, on my screen, Stanton is frozen.
Yeah, I think he's frozen. He's the best person to answer.
Yeah, I think I would like to follow up more with the person who asked the question to kind of better understand the situation. I think it kind of comes back to, well, whether it's on the state register or the federal register, who owns the property, what's sort of the management aspects, and contribute a little bit more to, ongoing activities with the family and care for that site. I think we'll have some, our contact information is out there. So for the person that asked the question, shoot me an email and we can talk more about it.
Thank you, Stanton. Elaine, maybe you can talk more about continuing use, because this also seems to relate to the fact that historic properties are not necessarily just kind of frozen in time. We talked about the active military base that is the Pearl Harbor National Historic Landmark. So can you talk a little bit about continuing use of properties?
All right, I'll talk a little bit about continuing use and private ownership. I mean, if a property is privately held, it doesn't limit the use of the property, or even if it's publicly held. But often this question comes from private property owners. The ownership doesn't change. You still own the property. You don't have to open it up for visitation. and there's continued use. We understand that, properties as they're being used will change over time. For example, when we were looking at the Iolani Palace, there have been changes to the property on the interior and probably on other aspects of the exterior that have brought it up to the present day to accommodate the present use. But those changes were done sensitively and helped preserve the historic character and character defining features of the property. And I think it is very important for people to understand that it's not a freezing of a resource in time.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. So here's another question, asking for examples of a historic property that might be obviously significant, either for one or more of the criteria. Let's see, so but maybe it may not be obvious, but I'm trying to understand this question. Let's see, how does that evaluation look? So some Hawaii examples, sorry, I misread this question. Some Hawaii examples of a property that might not be obviously significant. How do you go about finding out if there is some significance associated with it, if it's not, in your face like Iolani Palace? I'll take one stab at an example for this before other people can weigh in. And a lot of times I'd say if it's associated with historic events under A or historic people under B, you really understand that with the passage of time. And that's one of the reasons for the 50-year mark, because some things are not obviously significant until you look back on them. When you're in the middle of something like 9/11 or the attack on Pearl Harbor, that's obvious. You know as it's happening that it's a historic event. But something like the house that Bill Gates grew up in, or Steve Jobs invented the personal computer, you're not going to know that, during their, even during their lifetime sometimes. So looking back. So I think about Punahou Circle Apartments on University in Honolulu, which is the childhood home of what would be the future President Barack Obama. You're not going to know that by looking at it from the outside, but you understand that with the passage of time. So that may be one example of how significance becomes revealed after the fact. So I don't know, do others have some other examples that you might want to speak to?
I have a non-Hawaii example that I think that people could look up because it's a pretty nondescript building, and it's called McDonald Hall. It's located in San Jose, California, and it's featured on the Visit San Jose website. And if you drove past the building, it's pretty nondescript. But the history of the building, it was revealed that the building is associated with the early years of Cesar Chavez's community work. And the building also has been impacted as far as integrity, but it still was designated a National Historic Landmark. And so it's through the research demonstrating the connection to Cesar Chavez at a very important point in his life, one, and two, also knowing the history of the building over time, and to demonstrate, although at first blush, the building looks like there isn't integrity, but when you look at it more closely and research the history of the building and what is contained within the building, if you look a little deeper, that research helped to reveal that it did meet the integrity. In particular, not only the physical fabric, but the feeling and association. It was very important to the community.
Thank you. Stanton, not to put you on the spot, but I think this is often an issue with Native Hawaiian cultural sites. From the outside, it might just look like a pile of stones, but if you understand it. So maybe you can talk a little bit about cultural significance and how that relates to this question.
Yeah, well, sometimes there may be, sites that Native Hawaiian community folks aren't aware of, or they've heard anecdotal stories about, and need to do research further to better understand it. And maybe it's through some of those processes. I'm thinking about like a fish pond that may have been filled in that was once there, but there's, may not be evidence of it now, but there's, historical stories or, things that have been passed on. So it's a matter of doing that research and uncovering work to bring that significant.
I think we lost him again.
I think he was saying, bring that significance out to the public platform. So
yeah, I'll just take that idea and run with it. Fort DeRussy in Waikiki was fish ponds, before Waikiki was really filled in. And recently, there were some proposals to put in some electrical lines and traffic signalization and some infrastructure that really didn't affect anything on the surface, but those fish pond resources were still below the surface. And the State Historic Preservation Division really pressed the Army on their determination of eligibility for those sites in Fort DeRussy, and did find that it was eligible as an archaeological district, even though above the ground, there really wasn't a lot of evidence of that. So that's, I think, an example of something that may not be obvious to the casual observer, but some additional research made it apparent.
Thanks for bringing up that Waikiki example, because I think it ties back, or Waikiki and the iolani go back to our earlier webinars around Section 106. It gets to the heart of that, where if there are these sites where a federal undertaking is going to occur and the agency needs to engage in Section 106 consultation, that's the opportunity, another opportunity for the community to engage and raise those stories, bring that history to light in order to have it be considered as eligible for the National Register and something that agency needs to consider.
Great. Thank you, Stanton. Andrea, you look like you wanted to.
No,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to quickly mention, when we're talking about research, that included in research are oral histories and interviews. I just want to, as a historian, I think I have to say that and make sure that people understand that that's included as research.
I was thinking in terms of the same thing about, especially in light of all the different layers of history and how nominations should and can, and especially now with telling like multiple stories and fuller stories of the histories of places, how important it is to look at all different resources to be able to tell that, including oral histories.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions related to the nomination process, and specifically how to get that started. So there's the question, especially if a neighborhood group or a public interest group is seeing threats to historic properties, and maybe the owners aren't that interested in saving them, but the neighborhood would really like them to. Can the neighborhood group or the public interest organization start that process of nominating a historic property, and what does that look like?
I'll take a stab and then, yes, I mean, actually anyone can start that process. We did mention that if you have an owner, if you happen to know that you have an owner who would be vehemently opposed to it, the process could look like trying to maybe come together as a community and engage and find out, or if you know what the reasons are that the person is opposed to it. If it is definitely a community adventure to be able to nominate properties that you feel are significant. And sometimes it's not so much opposition that somebody may have as much as lack of knowledge of the process, and also perhaps fears of the restrictions that might ensue, many of which can be dispelled. So I think the education is to know what the property really come with, an arsenal of what the history of that property is and why it's so valuable, because the owner may also not know the different, the comprehensive history and not realize its value. So the process would begin by, I mean, please jump in, but I think that it is important to to understand the owner's relationship with the property, even though that is not the ultimate. There is a process, as we mentioned earlier, to navigate that if the owner is opposed. It just seems like it's a better idea to not do it behind someone's back.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I'll jump into that. Property owner notice is required. Consent is not necessarily required, but obviously you want consent. There was a recent case, again on Oahu, where the neighborhood nominated the Polly Lanes bowling alley in Kailua, and they did not have owner consent for that, but they felt that it was important and that it's a mid-century modern, 1950s, 1960s structure building. And the review board did approve it. In that case, the owner registered concern but not opposition. So they basically went on record and said, we're not real happy about this, but we're not going to fight it either, is kind of what it came down to. So that was one example. But usually if there's not owner consent, the owner does have due process rights. They can request what's called a contested case hearing, which is sort of a quasi-judicial, almost like a court proceeding. So there are very specific regulations and legal frameworks around that. But ultimately, at the end of it all, the review board has the right to make their decision of whether it meets the criteria or doesn't, and to list it or not. Now, on the National Register, that's not true. The National Register requires owner consent. There's a related question, and that is, what if the review board denies a nomination, and does the owner or the nominator have any recourse if they say no? And actually, I'll answer that basically the same way. The nominator can request a contested case hearing that puts it into that kind of quasi-judicial legal process to appeal that decision. But after that process, the review board's decision is final. They get to decide if it's going to be listed or not.
And for the National Register, I mean, it depends on, why the nomination was not approved. I mean, if it's the case that the argument just hasn't been made, there's always the ability to resubmit a nomination. If a nomination if a property isn't listed, the National Park Service provides a written explanation as to why. And if it's the case that it's the documentation, meaning an argument or something's missing or something like that, that's one case. But if it's the case that that the staff and the keeper have decided that it doesn't meet the criteria, then that's a whole different issue.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, I think, between is the form complete and accurate and make the case versus the inherent characteristics of the property itself. And, clearly to be listed, it needs to be both. It needs to be complete and have integrity and significance. So good, thank you, Elaine. Elaine, here's another question, I guess, National Register. If a property is owned by the federal government, who can start that designation process? Does it have to come from the agency, or can it come from, a local government or from an interest group? Who can nominate federally owned properties?
The actual starting of the nomination doesn't have to start with the agency. It could be an outside entity. However, the nomination, if the entire property is federally owned, that nomination has to go through the agency and has to be submitted by the federal preservation officer. I think it's helpful if you're working with the agency, and to be honest, you would probably need to at least access the agency's property in order to do the nomination. But anybody can write the nomination, but ultimately you're going to have to work through that federal agency to formally submit the nomination.
So this is just a completely made up example. As far as I know, it's not real, but say there's a wildlife refuge that includes some native Hawaiian fish ponds. So if the community group wants to do that research and write up the statement of significance and assessment, then they would talk to, say, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to actually move forward with it. Is that basically how
Yeah,
it
I mean,
works?
the nominations do go to, you know, like other National Register nominations, the SHPO, or in the case of Hawaii, the SHPD. They will look at them and comment on them, on the nominations, regardless of who prepares it. And then it goes back to the federal agency for submission by their federal preservation officer.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Let's see. Oh, actually, this relates to Haena, which was one of our examples of a living cultural community and sites associated. So when you have a traditional cultural site like Haena that has active farming, and how does that relate to the preservation goals of the register? So if you need to accommodate the farming use, have access to water, but you still want to preserve some of those historic features, what goes into those decisions and trade-offs, and basically how do you approach that?
I guess from my end, you know, just thinking about what Elaine said earlier is that, you know, a designation doesn't lock something in time. So there's a continued use of that area that contributes to its history and its significance. I'm not aware of
Stanton has frozen again, but especially with traditional cultural properties, so much of the significance is tied into the importance to the community and the use. You know, I think that it is a little bit different. Stanton, sorry, I was trying to fill in while you were frozen.
No worries.
I'll also just make a plug for our next seminar, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's going to be in March. And in that one, we're going to talk about treatments for historic properties and looking at some of the standards and guidelines for, I guess, a continuum of change. So there are some properties where, you know, you don't want to see a lot of change. The period of significance is so important that you don't want to see a lot of alterations or modifications. And then there are others that are part of a living community or living practice where there's a much greater tolerance for change. And we're going to talk about that more in depth in our next class. So I think that might be something to just ask you to come back and we'll talk about it more in depth. But in general, it really does come down to both how significant is it and what kind of change is being proposed. So in Haena, if they are doing traditional methods of farming and fishing, I think, you know, no problem. If they want to start bulldozing through all of those lo'i and doing, you know, mechanized farming or putting all the free flow water into contained pipes or something, that would be more problematic. Here's a question about the 50-year kind of rule of thumb. And, you know, for the state register, we talked about, or for state law, we talked about the need to be 50 years old to be considered, even to be looked at or evaluated to be historically significant. But that's not necessarily true for National Register. So if there's a property that is less than 50 years old, can it be evaluated for historic significance or listed on either state or National Register? So Elaine, you want to talk to the 50-year rule of thumb?
Sure. You know, we call it a 50-year, you know, as Kirsten said, rule of thumb or guidance, and it's to get that distance. However, there are within the National Register criteria, there's something called criterion considerations, and it addresses different types of properties that typically wouldn't necessarily be eligible for listing. And criterion consideration G addresses properties that are less than 50 years old. And in that case, you need to argue why it is significant, and that we do have the ability to determine and know why that property is significant. And so it's not that you can't, you just need to really address that issue of the property not being 50 years of age.
Thank you, Elaine. I will mention that the Pearl Harbor National Historic Landmark was designated in, I believe it was 64. So that was only about, what, 18 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor? And only, actually, I can't do math in my head, but it was about 20 years after the end of the war. And so much less than 50 years. And that, in part was because the obvious nature of the historic significance of World War II and the attack on Pearl Harbor and Oahu. So that's an example. I guess another example, East West Center, which is on the campus of University of Hawaii. It was built in the 60s, and it was designated to both the state and the National Register when it was about 40 years old. So that was another example of one that was recognized earlier than that 50-year mark. So there's a lot of these are questions about sort of the effect of historic designation. So, if a property is known to be historically significant, whether it's on or not on the register, what effect does that have? And are there protections in place? Are there restrictions in place? I think we can answer that one at a very high level, but maybe not get into all the details just because of the time available. So. Elaine, you want to talk about the effect of being on the National Register?
Sure. As I'll talk to the benefits that I've already addressed, that it doesn't change property ownership or anything like that. But, some of the benefits for listing on the National Register include something that we mentioned already, which is Section 106. While, a federal undertaking, say you have a property that's near a highway that is going to be widened, the agency is responsible for identifying historic properties. But if you have the advantage of already having identified a property that's listed and has a defined boundary that is established, it's kind of not arguable. And so that's one advantage. Also, if it's a property that has a business or has income based on the property, like a store or an office or something like that, you can potentially be eligible for federal tax incentives for rehabilitation projects. That's another advantage. I think those are the two broadest ones, in addition to just being proud of the fact that you have a property listed. But one other maybe that I'll mention is that, if you think of this as the official list, this meaning the National Register of significant properties in the history of the United States, it should be representative, right? If all we have are Victorian homes and high rises, that's not very representative of the history. And so I really think it's important to make certain that we have a wide range of types of properties represented on the register.
Thank you. Andrea or Stanton, would you like to speak to the effects of being a listed historic, not you as the historic property, but if a historic property is listed? Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay. As far as restrictions go for being listed on the register, there are certain things that you just need to rethink when you're trying to make changes to the property. There's not an overall restriction against making changes. You need to know what the significance is, which you would because it's listed, and then you need to be sensitive to that. And we'll be talking more about the Secretary of the Interior standards, as Kirsten mentioned, at our next seminar. So there's a lot that you can do. It's just the way you do it. And there's certain things that you can do. For example, if you have a residential property, you can put up solar panels. It's not a restriction, but you just would need to put them up thoughtfully, and you would need to be able to understand what that looks like. The benefits echo what a lot of the things Elaine said. It's also it's a documentation of the site, of the piece of history that the site represents, whatever its area or areas of significance, and to have the research done and to understand the value. Yes, it contributes to pride, but it also contributes to this grand puzzle or tapestry of our history. So it's a very important thing. And then there are also, for residential, for example, there's county tax exemptions and tax credits, and for federal, there's tax benefits. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this, and it's important.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute. But yeah, I echo everything that Elaine and Andrea had said. I just wanted to add, there's also, and maybe we don't have time to get into it on this call, but when a historic property loses its aspects of integrity, there's also that potential for it to come off the register or be delisted. And I was thinking, as an example, the Falls of Clyde, which is a ship in Honolulu Harbor, which is a National Historic Landmark. What does that process look like? I mean, it's up to the owner to maintain the historic integrity of the site, and if at some point it loses that integrity, that designation could be lost.
Which we hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we were getting quite a few questions actually about the role of advocacy and if there's a threat to a historic property. In that case, sort of a lack of funding or lack of, it's a ship that's sitting in salt water, so just natural processes as well. But also, if an owner is making active plans to demolish or to physically destroy a site. Those issues, of course, are universal. Change happens a lot, and sometimes there's destruction that comes along with that change. So I would love to actually have an entire discussion about advocacy and kind of steps and ways that people can help save places that matter to them. So if people are interested in that topic, I would really encourage you to put that in. Andrea will send out a follow-up email with a link to this recording and ask for any feedback, and you can just let us know that that's an area you're interested in. There's also some resources on historichawaii.org that speak to organizing or ways to look not just at historic designation, which is not always the most appropriate tool. Sometimes it's a zoning question, sometimes it's a purchase question, sometimes it's just having a good conversation with the owner. So there's more than one way to approach these issues, but I'm actually quite happy to see that quite a few people are interested in saving places that matter to them and looking at this as a mechanism for doing that. Which unfortunately we don't have time to get to all of our other questions, because I do want to just wrap up with some of those additional resources to let you know. Let's see. So at nps.gov, there's really all things that you need to know about the National Register. There's guidance on what it is, how to do the research, how to complete the form, how to interpret some of these trickier issues. What do we really mean by criterion A and so forth. So there's a lot of technical guidance and ways to proceed at nps.gov. The State Historic Preservation Division, of course, has all the information about the state register. So that's at dlnr.hawaii.gov. So you can find the agendas for the Historic Places Review Board, information about nominations that have been submitted, opportunities to submit comments. And of course, the SIPD website also has all of the statutes and procedures when proposed changes are being made. So the review and compliance laws as well. And then at our website, historichawaii.org, we have a really lovely guide it's sort of a how-to guide for nominating residences, so specifically for houses, to the Hawaii Register. So this is geared towards residential, but it really applies to all kinds of other kinds of historic properties as well. And one of my favorite sections of this guide is a illustrated architectural kind of vocabulary. It's sort of a dictionary. And this is, a PDF, it's free, you can download it. We also put on our website all of the properties that are approved to the state register. So if you want to know if something is listed, if you want to read through some of these nominations, especially if you have a property that might be similar and you want to see what some of their sources were, some of the descriptions, that is, we have, a map, we have a description, we have the links, so you can look at that. And it's divided by island and it's divided by type of property. And then we do have a section that we just called myths and facts, or facts and myths, which does answer some of these questions about, so you have a historic property, now what? So those resources are up there as well. We had some questions about our contact information. So we will be putting this entire slideshow up on our website, and we'll send out a link to it. So here's the contact information for Elaine, Stanton, Andrea, and myself, and you can get in touch with us. I mentioned that we have some upcoming seminars. The one we're planning in March will be on March 24th. It'll be on the standards and guidelines for treatment of historic properties. And then we haven't picked the date yet, but we are targeting May, so tentatively May. We want to do a session on the Native American Graves Protection or Repatriation Act, and also the Hawaii Burial Protection Statute. So this would be specifically for Native Hawaiian burials rather than cemeteries, so pre-contact primarily. So please watch for those. You can also be sure that you're getting notice of these and other programs that we do by signing up for our e-newsletter. So that is on our website. And I really want to thank our members and supporters who support the work of Historic Hawaii Foundation. You can learn more about what we do and sign up. We encourage you to join or support, and of course you can contact us as well. As we close out, please take a moment to fill in a very short survey with the course evaluation, and we really value your feedback as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you, mahalo to all of our panelists, for everyone who's been with us today, and aloha.
Aloha, everyone.